We now want to look at the characteristics of an oligopoly. So what characteristics create an oligopoly market and what's the impact of them? So an oligopoly market has a small number of firms. We said in a previous video that if we could count on our fingers the number of companies, then we have an oligopoly market. And then we looked in the previous video about how we can use the concentration ratio or Herfindahl-Hirschman index to help us flag these oligopoly markets. So a small number of firms. And when you have less competition, the businesses each have more market power, so they have the ability to influence the price. Why are there only a handful of companies in this market? Well, it's because there are barriers to entry. They can be legal barriers, right? So it could be that there are government requirements in order to run the company or operate the business. Maybe you are dealing with classified information or materials. So when we look at industrial chemicals, when we look at dealing with nuclear waste, right? We're not going to just let anyone and everyone do that. When it comes to working in secure areas, so we're talking about refueling planes, then we would want to limit the number of companies that can do those types of things. So there might be legal barriers where the government is limiting the number of competitors. There might be technical barriers, that is, only a certain number of companies have access to the resources or the know-how in order to produce a good or provide a service. There might be economic barriers to entry. So economies of scale means that businesses have big fixed costs, small marginal cost. So it makes sense for them to be a bigger company because they have to recover that cost of those infrastructure, those big fixed costs, and they want to spread them out across more and more units that they produce or services they provide. So to take advantage of economies of scale, the companies get bigger and bigger, and it's really not financially viable to be a small company in that market. When it comes to oligopolies can be differentiated or undifferentiated. As we talked before, if you can tell the goods apart, then people will buy for reasons other than price. So if you can differentiate your product, you gain even more market power, more influence over the price because people become less sensitive to the price. Demand is more inelastic. They buy for other reasons. Whereas an undifferentiated product, if we can't tell who made it, then we're simply going to buy based on price. So undifferentiated product markets that are oligopolies will have lower prices than differentiated oligopolies. They'll still all have higher prices than perfectly competitive markets based on the number of companies, but that differentiation also impacts the market power. The key thing we want to look at here is this last characteristic of an oligopoly: strategic dependence or mutual interdependence. The idea here is that the behavior of one company impacts the behavior of another. And so because there are only a handful of companies, when a company makes strategic decisions, they consider the decisions and behaviors that the other companies will have. Or they think about, well, what is the competitor likely to do? And then I'll make my decision based on that. Or if we do this marketing campaign, if we make this product, what will the competition do? If we change our price, what will the competition do? So there's a strategic dependence. Behavior of one impacts the behavior of another. Now, this strategic dependence or mutual interdependence, because the behavior of my company impacts you and your company impacts me, there's an incentive to collude. Right? If we're both going to be impacted by each other's behavior, we might as well get together and plan together. This is collusion, also called price fixing. It's an agreement between suppliers to set prices or quantities. So remember, because we're ultimately impacted by the demand curve, no business, even a monopoly, can set price and quantity to anything they want. You can change the price or you can change the quantity, but if you set the price, the quantity will be determined by demand. If you set the quantity, price will be determined by demand. So collusion is an agreement between suppliers to set the price or quantity. Typically, when we're talking about collusion or price fixing, businesses are getting together and saying, hey, let's produce less to drive the price up. This price fixing or collusion has been against the law in Canada since 1889. So since 1889, we have had what is called the anti-combine law. The anti-combine law came about because in the 1880s, CPR, so the railroad, they were given a 20-year monopoly on all rail traffic to Western Canada. Now, Manitoba was not happy about this. They had their own railway at the time, and they threatened to leave what was Canada at the time if CPR was given this monopoly. So a law was created, an anti-combine law, and the anti-combine law prohibits any undue or unreasonable constraints of trade. Undue or unreasonable constraints of trade. Now, we had the anti-combine law. In the US, they had the Sherman Anti Trust Act that came out about the same time. Now, the Sherman Anti Trust Act allowed the US government to actually divide up companies. So if there was too much consolidation, too much price fixing and collusion at the expense of the customers, they had the ability under the Sherman Anti Trust Act to chop these companies into pieces. And we talked about that in a previous video. But what about the anti-combine law? The anti-combine law, the problem with it is that it didn't have any teeth. Whereas the Sherman Antitrust Act could divide up companies, the anti-combine law really couldn't do anything. For example, under the anti-combine law, there was a lawsuit brought by Dominion Wholesale Grocers Guild. Okay, so this is an organization of grocery stores. And they were being sued by the government for price fixing on tobacco and sugar and pickles. So the way that it worked is that if you wanted to be a member of this guild, you had to agree to certain prices on products. And they only allowed the sugar refineries, there was a deal between these grocery stores and the sugar refineries. And the sugar refineries would only sell sugar to companies that agreed to sell at a certain price. So the sugar refineries would only sell to the guild. To be a member of the guild, you had to agree to sell the sugar at a certain price. Now, the government took them to court, charged them with anti-competitive practices, with collusion, and the companies argued that they needed these restrictions in order to make a living profit. In order for it to be worth their while to be in the business, to continue running the business, they had to be making a substantial profit to do so, and this was the only way to ensure the profit was there. The Canadian government ultimately did not convict them of price fixing or collusion. In fact, the only company that was ever really charged under the anti-combine law was the American Tobacco Company. This was actually a U.S. company operating in Canada. They were accused of collusion and no longer allowed to sell tobacco products in Canada. So they were the only company that was ever really charged under the anti-combine law, and they weren't even a Canadian company. So in 1986, we created the Competition Act to replace the anti-combine law and give it some teeth. So let's look at some examples of what has happened under that Competition Act. So there's been a number of cases, and they tend to take quite a while, where companies have been charged with collusion. So, for example, in 2007, the Competition Bureau of Canada charged Hershey's, Mars, and Nestle with collusion. What they were being accused of essentially is that their execs were meeting each other on golf courses and coffee shops and saying, hey, we'll produce less if you produce less to make the price go up. Well, in 2010, Cadbury paid the government $5.7 million, essentially saying, we'll plead guilty, we'll pay a fine, we'll provide you evidence against the other companies in exchange for you not charging us any further and giving us other fines. In 2013, the remaining companies, they settled this lawsuit for $23 million. Okay, so where does that number come from? Well, that number comes from the cost to the consumers because of the price fixing. So if these businesses intentionally produce less, create a shortage to drive up the price, then that means customers had to pay more for each bar of chocolate. And so we have the cost to the customer, plus there's usually some punitive damages for their misbehavior. So they settled in 2013 for $23 million. And if you still have the receipts from 2005 to 2007 when you bought a candy bar, and you spend more than $1,000 on candy bars in that year, you still have the receipts, then you can get some of that $23 million. Now you're probably saying, well, I don't keep my receipts for a candy bar. Really, a lot of this money was designed for the convenience stores and the vending companies who had purchased the candy wholesale large quantities. They had spent lots of money on the chocolate, and they lost profits because of that increased cost to them. Any unclaimed money, whenever there's an award like this, goes to encourage additional competition in the markets. There are other examples of rulings for collusion in the Canadian market. In 2009, KLM, Air France, Qantas, they were all charged with price fixing on air cargo being shipped to Canada. Air Canada had to pay a $29 million fine. 11 airlines in total paid over $1 billion. There is another one against Air Canada. Let's see. So Air Canada and WestJet were charged in 2016 with price fixing collusion on baggage fees. So a suit was brought against them for anti-competitive behavior. The idea here is that they all got together and agreed on adding baggage fees at the same time for similar prices. There are other examples. There was price fixing charges against companies in the US on baby formula, Sotheby's and Christie's on commission rates, Samsung for price fixing on memory chips. These are some examples that were more international. One that is fairly recent is that there's been a suit against companies that produce couches. And this one relates to the foam inside the couches. So the last couple of years, there was this window of time in 2017, 2018, where you could take a picture of the tag on your couch and submit it in order to get $20 per couch or mattress because of price fixing on the stuffing, that the foam that went inside of the mattresses. One more here. An international lawsuit, so this one not in Canada but in the European Union, was filed just recently, and this is charging Amazon in terms of anti-competitive prices or price fixing. In this case, what they're saying is that Amazon is taking advantage of the fact that they are both the market and a company in the market. So if you think about Amazon, there's Amazon products, the Amazon Basics products, and then there are other companies that you can buy from through Amazon. And what they're saying in this lawsuit is that Amazon is is participating in anti-competitive behavior because they are using their own data from the market to monitor which of these other companies' products are the most successful, and then replicating them in their Amazon basics and basically replacing those companies in the market with the Amazon product. So again, when we look at this collusion, this anti-competitive behavior, are we keeping out the competition? Are we working together with the competition to reduce the output and charge higher prices? These all have laws against them in Canada, in the US, and the European Union. So the structure of an oligopoly, the fact that we have this strategic dependence or mutual interdependence, this fact that the behavior of one impacts the behavior of others, creates an incentive for businesses to collude, for them to work together rather than compete because their behavior impacts another and the others impact them. So it does create this incentive to collude, and our solution has been to create laws against that collusion, okay, particularly price fixing, with the Competition Act in Canada and the Sherman Anti Trust Act in the US. But it's the nature of the oligopoly itself that creates this incentive to collude. And so to better understand this incentive to collude, we're going to recall game theory that we discussed earlier this semester and Nash equilibrium. And we're going to do that in the next video.